Hi, this is Kelly McFall, and this is the last video for NSP 4703 Memories of Combat. I had meant to do a number of these. I apologize for not getting the chance to do more of them. I had significant equipment issues, but I won't say more. My apologies are enough. I wanted to say a little bit as the final paper comes along about some of the observations I've made in the course of grading your papers. And I'll just kind of run through these very quickly. I've tried to make comments on each of your papers in a way that's succinct enough that you will read them, but specific enough that they will help you. But there were enough common comments that I wanted to focus on a few specific things. And I will say, just really quickly, I hope that you all do the course evaluations. This is the first time I've taught online, and in particular the first time I've tried to give paper comments online. And I tried one way and I tried to be consistent with it throughout, and I would love some sense of whether that was the most effective way to do it. So as you think about the final paper, and here I'll just start by reminding you of something I said in the email I sent earlier today, which is that this is a different paper assignment than the one you saw in the video. And it's meant to give you a chance to focus more specifically on the last two books that we are talking about in the class and that you read. And it asks you to compare and contrast those. And as you do, clearly you want to compare and contrast them on content, but you also want to compare and contrast them on style. Style, not really in the sense of detailed versus non-detailed or colorful versus non-colorful, but the way in which the writers, the authors of these books, do or do not try and fit themselves into a broader set of expectations and experiences and traditions in terms of writing about warfare, right? So you're welcome to talk about that one was more detailed than the other and that kind of things if you want, but in terms of style, what I'm really looking for is a sense of whether these people tried some of the methodological experiments that the earlier authors did, whether they fit into kind of the continuum of authors that starts with people like Vonnegut and moves through O'Brien, or whether they're just writing in a pretty standard traditional narrative memoir tradition. So both content, right? What kind of content lessons or understandings can we bring out of them regarding Iraq, and style. And here, this is just a minor point, but it's actually kind of important. A number of you refer, broadly speaking, to every book you've read as a novel. That's not so. A novel actually is a specific kind of long-form writing with its own rules, its own traditions, its own genre expectations. In particular, a novel is fiction. And so if you are calling a novel, a memoir, for instance, by Manchester, if you call that a novel, it is a specific understanding of what Manchester is trying to do. And you're welcome to do that, but then you need to prove that to me. You need to give evidence as to why you think he's writing an intentionally fictional piece with a uniform plot that carries over multiple chapters, rather than a memoir, right? So I know on one level it seems silly, it's just a label, but in fact that label stands for something. And in a class about how people try to place themselves in a particular tradition by writing certain kinds of works, it's actually an important distinction. So, as you go ahead and think about your papers, one of the things I've noticed is that it seems to be very difficult for many of you to, or perhaps I should say, there's no coherent understanding among the group as to what a thesis is. And I know that you've been working on this now since you were in 5th grade, and I know clearly some high school teachers have a different understanding of what a thesis is than college does, and that sometimes survives for more than a few semesters. Here I just want to point out, a thesis is not a table of contents. When you say, I am going to compare and contrast the style and content in the two books under examination, that's not a thesis statement. A thesis statement rather is a brief 1 or 2 sentence summary of the big claim you're going to make in the paper. I should be able to read that thesis statement, which should come in a paper this short, toward the end of the first paragraph, maybe at the end of the second. I should be able to say, okay, this is the one big idea this person has in this paper, and I should read the rest of the paper with an eye toward deciding whether this one big claim is correct or not. All right. So that's what a thesis is at a college level. And it's that way for a purpose. As a reader reads your paper, you are making a claim, or sometimes more than one claim. Although in this short of a paper, one or two claims is really as much as you can really successfully defend. And to successfully evaluate as a reader whether that claim is correct, it is helpful to know what the claim is before you read the paper. A number of you came out at the end of your paper or at the end of sections of your paper with the claim about with the final kind of, this is the big claim I've made by writing this paper. And that's okay, but then the reader has to go back and read it again to try and decide whether that claim that you've come to is appropriately defended. You don't want to do that. You don't want to make the reader have to go back again. So, first thing to note, thesis, toward the beginning of the paper, summarizes in a sentence or two the big claim you're making in your paper. Then, second point, the whole organization of the paper is then derived based on that big claim. Each section of your paper should support that claim in one way or the other, and should tie back to that claim, so I understand exactly what point this section of the paper is going to accomplish. Each section should accomplish one step in the proving of your claim. Sometimes that means going book by book by book, and if your claim is that these 3 books accomplish a certain thing, then the sections of your paper are easily divided by book, and each then topic sentence or each introduction to that next section summarizes quickly how that book accomplishes what you say it accomplishes in the thesis. There are other kinds of theses, and they then require other kinds of organizations, and that's fine. In particular, to say that 2 books are similar in some ways and different in others is true, but not actually a coherent, thoughtful argument. A thesis and then the organization around it should say more than just 2 things are similar and different. Almost everything in the world is both similar and different from something else. So what does that mean? That means topic sentences for your paragraphs that show what point your paragraph is going to make and shows how that paragraph connects to other paragraphs. It means don't start your paragraph with a quote. A quote is evidence. It's not the argument itself. The quote comes after, or the story or the account or whatever you're using to support your point comes after you make the point. It doesn't stand in for the point. It means at the end you have a conclusion. And here again, it's not a conclusion that for the first time finds a thesis. It's a conclusion that reaffirms the thesis, briefly reminds the reader of how you supported your thesis, and maybe broadens out a little bit to say why it's important. As you do this, you want to support your points, as I said, with examples from the text. This can be quotes on occasion, but the general rule is don't quote unless you can't say it better yourself. You can summarize. You can change the wording to make it sound more appropriate for your style. You can condense. And if necessary, you quote. Partly this is a way to prove your argument. Partly, and let's be honest and frank here, it's a way of making sure I know you read the book rather than you read the Wikipedia summary of the book. I don't really think many of you have done that. I've been pretty impressed with the summaries that you've given, and I'm pretty sure that most of you are reading the books. But as a professor, I've got to be able to evaluate it. That's one of the things I use to evaluate a paper. Then, one of the things you have to do in a paper is to acknowledge possible counterarguments. This was especially an issue in the second paper, where a number of you made claims about, for instance, Manchester, and the fact that he was not particularly linear, and he spent all of this time digressing into this account of visiting various islands, and you thought that that was not important to the way he understood his experience of combat. That's a perfectly valid claim. I'm not invalidating that at all. But it is equally valid to say, or perhaps more, to say that the travel narratives were an essential part of the book, because the book was in fact not really about combat, but because of his attempt, or was about his attempt to reconcile his experience with combat with the world he found himself in. And so the travel narratives can't be taken out of the book, because combat was not just the experience of the experience of combat was not just the experience of being in combat, but was about the experience of living with combat for years and years and years afterwards. Now, you are perfectly welcome to make the first argument rather than the second, but both of them are plausible. Both of them can be supported with evidence. And so if you're going to write an A paper, you need to explain why you prefer argument number one over argument number two. Right? So that's a place where many of you ended up with B's rather than A's, because you didn't quite do that. Finally, in terms of paper, well, I guess I should say briefly, make sure you pay attention to those red and green squiggly lines. While grammar is not the most important thing in the world, it is critical to be able to communicate effectively in whatever profession you're in. And part of the reason that these upper-level core classes are writing intensive is because you will need to write, and write effectively in your career, even if it's just in brief notes. And I can tell you from personal experience, the inability to write grammatical prose has gotten teachers fired of my children. It has gotten people who asked for my business. It has meant that they did not get my business. It is a very practical job skill to be able to communicate clearly and effectively. So I do grade on grammar, although probably not as heavily as I would wish. The last thing I would say about papers is to recognize as you write that these authors are exceptionally good writers who have thought deeply about how to present their material. You, as you write, need to think hard about why they made the choices they did. Part of the essence, or part of the core of the course, is to demonstrate to you, or to show you, the way in which this tradition of writing about combat has changed over time, and about how many people who write about this are drawing on examples from past authors. Now, you may not think that's very appropriate. You may not think the resulting writing is very interesting, and that's fine. I do not have any problem with that if you think that Vonnegut is not demonstrating combat very well. But you have to think hard about why they're making the choices they do as you think about how to write your paper. Now, it's possible, perhaps, I don't know, that you'll decide Squire isn't thinking that hard. I probably disagree, but I could see maybe why you would reach that conclusion. But you've then got to show me why you think it. So the final thing I wanted to say in this relatively brief video, I hope you take the last set of discussion prompts seriously. Because I do want this to be an academic course. I do want you to get some sense of the narrative tradition and the way it emerges in the 21st century. But I really hope that spending 8 weeks immersed in people's writing about combat gives you a new perception and a new window into the kinds of experiences people around you who are veterans have had. Now, some of you are veterans, and I hope that you have a better ability to articulate that experience and share that experience with other people. Others of you, many of you, are not veterans, and I hope you have a better sense of the experience of combat. And I hope you have been challenged during the semester to think not just about the combat experience, but about what that means for the experience of veterans coming home, and the way in which you and they will interact together over the course of the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. And so I encourage you to think carefully about that last set of discussion prompts. I know you're concentrating on the paper, but please also concentrate on those. So, have a great summer. I hope that you are going to enjoy a week or two off before school starts again. And please, if you have any questions, I'm on email. That's been interrupted occasionally as my computer died and I had to get a new computer, and then that computer was stuck in the IT people, with the IT people as they tried to download Windows to it. But I have it now. I'm available on email, or feel free to text. And thanks for taking the course.